Welcome to our generation. My name is Bernard Conlon. Today I'm talking to Belfast poet and Irish-American poet Joe O'Connor, otherwise known as Padraic Fiacc. Okay, Joe, can you tell me where you were born and what year you were born in?
Belfast, it was Elizabeth Street, and 1924. I remember my father coming home from work. He was a bartender.
And what was your father's name?
Bernard O'Connor.
Whereabouts was your father from?
Arva, County Cavan.
And your mother? What was your mother's name?
Annie Christina. She was from the McGarry family.
Was she from Belfast or was she also from Cavan?
Lisburn.
Have you any particular memories of Elizabeth Street? Can you remember playing in the streets with other children?
There was a woman who hated children, and she baked her own bread. And when we heard her pounding the dough, we thought she was pounding at some child.
From Elizabeth Street, did you move to the markets?
Well, about 3 or 4 years. East Street.
So do you have any memories from that area, from that time?
My mother's people were burnt out of Lisburn, and her mother, my grandmother, lost her mind, and I was left with her. She watched over me, and it was dicey sometimes.
Just remind me of what your mother's name was, Joe.
Annie McGarry.
And she came from Lisburn.
Yes.
And your father was a Cavan man. You said he worked in the bar trade in Belfast in the early 1920s. Did he say much about what life was like for a barman in Belfast at that time?
No. He when he got to America, he very seldom mentioned Ireland. He was so glad to get out of it. There was a TB rash at that time, and he was glad to get out of Ireland.
He went across the Atlantic and didn't turn back, so to speak. What about your mother? What were her feelings about...
Well, he went to America and he left us 3 young brothers with our mother. He would send her money, and she would go out and buy some costume with it. And she just lived it up with the money, and it was getting that he didn't know whether she was going to come back to him or what. So my grandmother blew her stack because she wanted us to go to America. And she was telling the girls in work that she wasn't going to go on a boat if she had to go steerage, which the Irish had to do because they didn't have the money. And so one of the girls said, did you ever bet on a horse? And she said, no. We said, why don't you bet on a horse? And she did, and she won 91 pounds.
I see.
So that got us second class.
Very good. A little stroke of luck. So there was money coming from America, so to speak, your very early and formative years in Belfast. But eventually the time came...
Well, we had to go.
Had to go. Do you have any memory of violence or conflict in Belfast at that time? It was the mid-1920s. It was quite quiet, was it?
It was a quiet period after the First World War, except that everybody went half mad when the war was over.
I see.
And my mother was what you called a flapper. Mm-hmm. She went half mad too, love style. Mm-hmm. And that's all I remember of that.
So you're, from what your parents said, from what your mother said, from what your father said, do you have any recollection of the troubles at that time from the Irish Civil War? From
what they told me, the Civil War was still on. Mm-hmm. And Belfast was noted all over the world at that time as a police state. Mm-hmm. Because it was held together by the police.
I see.
And my father didn't didn't show any interest whatsoever. And he worked for the IRA. He was pulled into it as a bartender from the south of the Free State. And he never spoke to me about any of that. But my mother never lost her being a rebel. She resented that we had to go to America at all.
She was reluctant to go to America.
That's right.
Right. But those early years, those first 5 years in Belfast, Joe, did they shape the person that you became? Did they influence what you became, becoming a writer? Were they influenced, do you think, by that early experience? And the influence of people like your mother, the influence of people like your grandmother, were they coming into your, they shaping your personality?
Because they had a Scots-Irish way of talking, and the word remained with us in America as a child. And I was educated in America after that.
So your first 5 years were in Belfast, but that's a very short period in anybody's life.
Yeah.
America intervened. When exactly did you go to America? Was it in 1929?
Yes.
Right. That was a very important, a very symbolic year to go to America with the Wall Street crash.
Right.
Do you have any memories or recollections of that journey across the Atlantic?
Oh, yeah. It was the Cunard line, the Titanic line, and we were in the very waters where the Titanic sank, and everybody was afraid of any icebergs that they saw. But everybody was happy on the boat. They just lived it up in the boat to get away from all the misery.
So life back in Belfast, both for older people but also for younger people, was pretty miserable.
It was, because there was a lot of poor people.
And the memory of the Belfast that you left behind, do you recall there being any future or any provision for children at all? Was life pretty basic for everybody at that time?
Yes, but it was after a war, you see. Mm-hmm. Ireland became neutral in the Second World War.
Of course.
But in the First World War, a lot of Irish people joined the British forces.
So basically, your memory of Belfast before going to America was basically through your parents' eyes and through your parents' memories.
Yes, because in America, I noticed that my mother didn't want to be in America. And in a way, she gave me the same loathing of being in a foreign country. And I carried that through school, early school.
Just coming back, Joe, to what your mother was saying, you're saying that your mother wanted to stay in Belfast at that time. She was reluctant to cross the Atlantic.
She was a mad rebel. Mm-hmm. She resented her having to leave her own country.
Right.
And it was a principle with her. But eventually, the old woman whose mind had started to go wanted rid of the responsibility of children.
That was one of the reasons why your mother left, because her mother wanted to be free of...
Oh, yeah.
Okay. What I'm hearing from you is that your perception, your image of Ireland was shaped by your mother. That your mother, she left an imprint in your mind,
yes,
in terms of...
her and the grandmother. The grandmother came from people called Crossans. They were considered the aristocrats of Belfast. They were beautiful people. And my mother was a beautiful woman. And she had a certain arrogance from the Crossans.
So you went across with your mother to America in 1929, and just as you were crossing the Atlantic, the Depression erupted.
That's right.
And suddenly your father lost his business, is that?
Right.
So how did that affect the family, Joe?
He became a grocer. Mm-hmm. He got help from relatives he had who were money people, and he owned 2 grocery stores. But then you see the Depression hit, and he lost both of the stores. We were living in a beautiful apartment that his money people got for us on 96th Street. And we had a maid, an old lady who took us to school and helped my mother with the housework and all. And when the Depression came, Blanche had to go, and so she lived in Germantown, and she went to Germantown and killed herself.
This was the family maid, was it?
Yes.
What nationality was she, Joe?
Austrian.
Austrian. And did she speak English?
Yes.
So what part of New York was that when your father had his business? Before the Depression, what part of New York was that in?
Amsterdam Avenue, in a kind of Irish ghetto, uptown west side, the west side story.
So 1929 comes, the Great Depression, your father loses his business. What happens to the family at that point?
Well, we were at school. We had to eat free lunches and things at school, you know. The Irish policemen in New York were very good to the Irish, and they could be bribed very easily. It just shook hands with them. Could have killed somebody, but if the dollar bill was in the shaking of that.
You mentioned school. What was the name of the school that you went to, Joe, in New York?
Well, the first one was Holy Name. It was run by the French brothers, de La Salle, and I was only there for a couple of years. And then we moved to Amsterdam Avenue, and the church and the school was just around the corner from where we lived. The school was run by Sisters of Charity. It was a nunnery that was made in America. And they taught us until we went to high school.
Right. So did you receive a good education despite the social conditions in New York? Your father was a small businessman. He was affected by the Great Crash in 1929. Yeah. But despite that, you still went to school, you still received a good education?
Oh, yeah.
Right. When you were maturing as a young man, as a teenager, as a young man in New York, did you have any link back to Belfast? Was there any family contact? Were there any journeys or trips or visits?
The Irish in New York were largely from the south of Ireland. And we were unusual because we were from the north of Ireland. And my father fraternized with a whole lot of people from the south of Ireland. And my mother always seemed a bit different. She had a different way of speaking than the Irish from the south.
So, Joe, what you're saying is you were actually rapidly becoming a New Yorker. You were becoming an American. And all the social and economic problems were fading in your memory.
I didn't understand Belfast. And when I was in the seminary, I told the seminarian I was going to go back to Belfast. And he said, "Don't go back to Belfast, they'll shoot you." But you see, that was all around the world, that they would kill one another.
So really, in a way, you had effectively emigrated with, your mother had eventually emigrated, your father had established various businesses in Belfast. You grew up, your formative years were in New York rather than in Belfast. You had left Belfast when you were a 5-year-old child.
Yeah.
And your only real link was through the memory of your mother.
That's right.
So you were on a pathway to becoming a priest.
But that was after I left school. One Christmas Eve, when I was about 12 years old, my father was drunk and my mother and him were fighting. And I overheard them fighting. And I said to myself, well, if this is marriage, I'll never get married. So the next morning, I said, I won't get married, I'll go away and be a priest. The next morning I wrote to Franciscan priests in upstate New York, telling them my situation, that I couldn't my father couldn't afford to send me to a Catholic high school. And I wrote to them, and they wrote back, and they said, go to a public high school, but make sure that it teaches Latin. Well, that was pretty hard.
What age were you when you entered the seminary?
13.
Okay, and what age did you leave the seminary at?
About 20.
About 20, okay. Why didn't you become a priest? What prevented the, I suppose, the consolidation of the vocation?
Almost every seminarian spent a week in the seminary and said, oh, I'm not going to stay. We all went through a week or two saying, oh, I definitely won't stay here. And we did stay.
Right.
And in my case, I couldn't leave because the draft was on.
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Sam needs you and all that, you know. And I was determined not to go into any kind of an army.
So you wanted to avoid the draft and the seminary?
I couldn't leave the seminary because I was there on a bursary. Some rich woman had paid for my education.
Right.
And if I had left, that money would have to be returned to the woman.
Where was your sense of religious belief at this stage? Were you a fervent believer, or was the church a shelter from the outside world?
No, you see, in Hell's Kitchen, the misery I saw there, and side by side with the Catholic Church, which was a rich church, and I began to doubt that this was a church that Christ really wanted, a rich church, and you know, and I always had a private view of the church, and in the seminary it started to work in me, but I was trapped. I couldn't do anything.
So you were avoiding the draft.
Of course,
The seminary that you stayed in Upper New York State was an Italian, was run by Italian priests.
Yeah, you see, what do you call those people, those Italians? I'm forgetting names.
The mafia?
Mafia, yeah. What they did, they had a simple idea of being a Catholic, and they thought, like the Pope that caused the whole Reformation, they thought they could buy their way there. So they would leave a big mansion that they had to the church as a seminary, right? And this was a beautiful building and beautiful grounds. And I suspected that the mafia had left it.
That's a good story. The other aspect, Joe, you were avoiding the draft. Were you developing artistically? Were you, I mean, you'd learned the piano, you were interested in classical music.
Yeah. An unusual thing happened in Hell's Kitchen. The school had an overload of black people. White people were a minority in it. But there were refugees from Europe, from Hitler, the Jews that were able to get to America, and I went about to a crowd of those people, and that got me into art, a whole different world.
You were in the seminary, Joe. What happens then? You start to fade out from the seminary. You've learned.
Then I had only one determination to get. Well, actually, it was difficult leaving the seminary, and the head man in the seminary was an old Irish-American person, and he used to bring me into his office to show me pictures of his statistical army and all that. And I was the best boy to him because I was born in Ireland.
I see.
And the thing that I missed the most in the seminary was New York City.
Right.
Is once you live in it, you have a hunger for it.
You were a New Yorker, Joe.
Yeah,
You were a New Yorker.
That's it.
You were in the seminary during the war. But then you've learnt to speak Latin, also poetry. Where did the poetry come from?
The school was taught by a Jewish communist. The Jews swung to communism, to Stalin, because Hitler was fighting Stalin. They were becoming communists. I got bored listening to all this propaganda, so I crossed him one day, and he liked it, and the two of us started to argue, and I only made believe I was the enemy, you see.
I see.
I said, you don't speak about Generalissimo Franco in those terms. That got him wired up.
How did you leave the seminary, and how did your life progress?
I had to go to another seminary.
I see.
And there was a monastery. I was going to become a Capuchin monk, it was an Irish Capuchin. Philadelphia, around that section, there was an Irish monastery that just started near the Delaware River. I can't remember the name of it, but they were so glad to get me because I was the only student they had. They had just started.
I see.
And it was a bit cynical on my part, and the Irish priests were completely different from the American priests. They liked to drink, and there was a lay brother in it, and he had to act as the housekeeper and cooking the food, and he hated them. And when he gave them the dinner, he threw the plates on the table. But he and I used to drink the sacristy wine at night, and we became great friends.
So you were drinking partners.
Yeah, and friendly. He was from the 1916 rebellion period.
Right.
And he used to tell me stories about it.
When you were in the seminary, you had been writing poetry. So at what point did your poetry start getting published?
This communist teacher told me, he said, you have a real gift for words. He said, why don't you go home and write a poem for me? And I did.
What age were you at that time?
About 14.
I see. Just to move forward a little bit, Joe, you met a young woman.
This girl wrote to me all of a sudden from Detroit, Michigan, and she said, I wrote to your publishers, but they told me that you are here in America. And I came across you in a book called New Irish Poets. It was published in New York. And 5 of my poems, and I was the youngest poet in the book. And a picture of me that I studied it as a priest and left, of course, for bad health or something. But she fell in love with all that.
This connection with this young woman was through the poetry that you had started writing.
Yeah. Then the religious thing. She studied to be a nun.
I see.
And another nun tried to poison her. And I don't know whether she remained a nun or not, but the idea that I studied to be a priest, she was a religious person.
You had been in the seminary, you'd learnt to play the piano, you'd become an all-round creative and artistic person. But it sounds as if the seminary and the church had provided some kind of double purpose. It was a shelter from what was going on in the outside world, but it also allowed you to evolve and emerge as an artist and as a thinker. When did you come back to Belfast, Joe? Because I know you've had this amazing life in America. What year was it you came back across the Atlantic?
I first came back in 1946. Ulster was considered a police state. I used to go with my cousin walking at night, which you couldn't do now. But in a police state, we were able to walk anywhere at night. I got a job as a night porter in a hotel. It was a whorehouse.
This was in Belfast?
Yes. Then I got a job looking after a dying man. He had multiple sclerosis, MS. My sister was living with my father, and he was drinking because my mother died and all. And I renounced my American citizenship. If you renounce your citizenship, you have to be out of the country.
I see.
You're not allowed to do it in the country.
I see.
And I had a British passport, an Irish passport, and an American passport. And I said to myself, this is ridiculous. And I had an Irish passport and was keeping that. I renounced my American passport, and it didn't matter to me about the British passport. And the woman in the office, who was the head consul or something, she said to me, "My dear boy, nobody renounces their American citizenship." And I said, "What about Greta Garbo and Charlie Chaplin?" She says, "You are not Greta Garbo." And she took a second look at me, and I was wearing baggy pants and a wee mustache.
So, can you remember what year that was in?
48.
1948. What were the conditions in Belfast like after the war? What difference did you perceive?
They made believe nothing was happening. The English were calling their bomb. They were being bombed every night. They called it the Blitz. Well, this was the English way to keep a stiff upper lip and call it a different name. It wasn't bombing, it was the Blitz.
I see.
But Ireland had whole streets gone, a whole block of streets gone in Belfast. And they still had the rations, food were rationed. This was after the war. And clothes was rationed, everything.
And you went back to America after that?
In 52, I went back to America because my mother died.
I see. So you also have this young woman in America who has fallen in love with your poetry. You just during this whole period, during the 1950s, you were still in touch with this young woman, yes?
She kept writing beautiful letters, style, beautiful, and drew little, what do you call those little pictures that like stamps, the size of them, beautiful, and sent me wonderful postcard of paintings, and I knew she was sophisticated and loved the paintings. One time she sent me a postcard of Chagall's wedding of two people who were standing upside down. And my father said to me, "What is she? Is she a gypsy?" And she says, "I'm going to go to New York." She was educated in Fordham, I think. Is that the
Fordham University in New York, yes?
Yes. And she had rooms there or something. And about 10 blocks down, we were Amsterdam Avenue. And Fordham was in a very ritzy part of Central Park and all.
Yes. And you came back to Belfast in 56?
And got married here.
And whereabouts in Belfast did you get married?
Ardoyne.
Got married in the Holy Cross?
Holy Cross, yeah.
And that was in 1956. What was it like coming back to Belfast in the mid-1950s, Joe? It must have been a very bizarre experience, having become, in your own words, a New Yorker.
I was such a New Yorker, I couldn't make the transition back to Belfast.
You're back in Belfast, 1956. You get married in the Holy Cross Church up in Ardoyne.
That's right.
You're a New Yorker. You have an American wife.
She came from the rich family of the Waynes. The Waynes founded Detroit, and they were a big name in Detroit. I didn't really know that she had money, but it finally got into me, and I said to her one day, after we got married in Belfast, we got married in Holy Cross, we had this monstrous reception. And the mother was flying over, her mother was flying over with her son. I had to let the mother know, with this money business, everything became underground. I had to let the mother know that I had friends. And I invited all the people in the markets to come to the reception, and it was wild.
It was a wild reception.
So in the Grand Central Hotel. Yeah.
In the Grand Central in Royal Avenue in Belfast, and this was 1956.
Yeah.
But Belfast was quite quiet in that period. It was like
That's right.
the lull before the storm, wasn't
That's
it?
right. That's right.
Where did you go to live when you came back and got married in Belfast with your American wife?
She went out one day and she bought a house in Glengormley, and it was a surprise to me because I liked staying in the university district where we were staying.
Whereabouts in Glengormley was that, you?
Farmley Park, it was called, near the bank. She brought me to the house to see it for the first time, and I was horrified at the suburban, everything that a New Yorker couldn't cope with. A big lush hydrangea on the middle of the lawn, and I looked at the gardens and I said, oh my God, I'm going to have, this is going to be my life now, just gardening. Well, we moved in it and we became happy at it. It was a Protestant street, and the Protestants were so thrilled that these two Americans were coming to live in Glengormley, and they were very kind and friendly. And I won a big award, the A award, and it was in the Belfast Telly and all that. And I had to put my hands up as a champion when they'd be passing them by.
So the people in Glengormley had a famous Yank living
right.
in their midst.
The lie was that I was living off my royalties, and because she kept her money very quiet, and it was her who read in the Irish Times about the AA award, and she said, why don't you enter for that? And I said, Nancy, that's a Dublin prize, I said, and in 1,000 years I wouldn't get it. And she says, well, I'm from Belfast, Nancy. Mm-hmm. And she says, but it says here, you have to be born in Ireland. Mm-hmm. She said, Belfast is Ireland. Mm-hmm. So I thought she would be all pleased with it. When I won it, the publicity was too much for her. Mm-hmm. And it kind of broke something between us.
I see.
I suddenly realized that at the time I was writing for a Dublin journal, just reviewing books for it. And when she would read the review, she would say nothing, mm-hmm. absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. And anytime I was published anywhere, she didn't comment on my work at all.
Your role as a writer and your relationship were affected by you being an emerging writer.
Becoming famous.
I see. And what was the surrounding area like? What was the atmosphere? Was there any sense of sectarianism, any sense of the storm that was going to befall Belfast at the end of the 60s? The awful nightmare of sectarianism and what we call the Troubles, the conflict, it was coming right at the end of the 60s. Did you have any sense of that coming?
The thing about the early Troubles was we were all terrorized because we didn't know what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. We were living in a state of dread, and that was real being terrorized, the early part of it.
Joe, did the thought ever occur to you, you were in this city that was the city of your birth, but you were a stranger in the city of your birth. You were a New Yorker. Right. You were a poet, you were a writer, you played music.
Yeah.
You were living in a Belfast suburb in the 1960s. Did you ever think, you had an American wife, did you ever think that you should go back across the Atlantic again?
We did go back across, but only because her brother died.
So you did go back and forth to America a little bit during the 60s. Belfast and Northern Ireland at that time looked as if it was a happy place, but something underneath the surface was brewing. Yeah. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah.
And your writing was influenced and was drawn towards the storm?
Well, my first collection of poetry appeared in '69 and published by Dalman Press in Dublin. Mm-hmm. That was a good press. And I dedicated the book to her. She didn't even look at it. Mm-hmm. And then when I really started to write about the trouble, she was horrified. And of course, she was thinking of a divorce, and being religious, she wanted an annulment.
So your relationship was going through a stormy time. You were back in Belfast. You had your American wife. You were starting to write about the troubles. What was it that was driving this desire to explore this dark subject?
Well, I was getting terrible headaches, and I realized there was something wrong. I thought it was a tumor or something, and Nancy sent me to the doctor, and he examined me, and he said, "It's definitely not physical." So that meant it was mental.
Mm-hmm. You had witnessed Belfast as a very positive place during the 1960s. There was a lot of hope. Where did it go?
Well, you see, I went deep into it, and I come from a Republican background, and I didn't want that to be the basis, but it helped me. Mm-hmm. And then my illness together, you see, and I had one breakdown after another.
And this was relating to your relationship. But Nancy also, when the troubles broke out in the late 60s, she was horrified by the atmosphere of Belfast at that time.
And she really wanted to get out.
And strangely, at the same time, you were fascinated by what was going on.
Well, not fascinated, but I don't know what started me writing about it. But
can I say, was there a trigger factor? Was there something that tripped off that interest?
My schizophrenia came to surface, and I realized that I understood both sides, mm-hmm. and I was going to write about both sides, and that gave me some kind of
understanding.
Yeah, and my wife left me and went to the South, and they wouldn't give her a divorce down there, so I had to divorce her up here and get her a church annulment. Mm-hmm. And I did all that, and I opened the house in Glengormley to young writers, students, and that's how, well, Brendan knew me before that, but Jerry Daw, Jerry Daw asked Brendan to introduce. Mm-hmm. They were in the same college.
What other writers came to the house in Glengormley? Were there many writers?
Oh, yeah. Haney came, John McGarren came, a whole lot of people. Derek Mahon dedicated a poem to me, mm-hmm. but only because I asked him to. I shouldn't have done that.
You mentioned your illness. Do you think our society here had an illness?
I think it's schizophrenia too. Deep division.
So do you think your sense of your mental situation give you an understanding of the society that you found yourself in?
That's right.
So you're actually saying that we had an illness, a social illness in this part of the world. As you mentioned a little earlier, one of the important milestones in terms of a writer as a poet when you came back to Belfast was the writing of this book, The Wearing of the Black. Say a little bit about that. What was the inspiration behind that? Who inspired you as a writer before, and tell me where this book came from and what was the issue surrounding this book?
Well, as an American coming over here, my education wasn't a British education, and British education and American education are miles apart. Mm-hmm. Especially in public American, mm-hmm. I was public school American, and I saw as an American the prejudices that they had in America, and I understood why people were prejudiced and all. But what I couldn't take was 3,000 people murdered and buried, and it didn't happen. I wasn't allowed to say this, or I wasn't allowed to say that, and there was a nucleus of young poets came to my house, and they tried to stop me in a way, but I went on and I published the thing, and
You were published or be damned.
is right, and I was damned.
So your honesty, your confrontation of the reality that you
It was-
perceived
Yeah.
led you to being ostracized. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
I was always ostracized. But the more I got into it, the more I realized I was doing something to help both sides.
But the book, The Wearing of the Black, was an important milestone, both in a good way and a bad way.
To begin with, everybody hated the cover. And it was, when I would go to the bookshops, the book would be turned this way, so you couldn't see the cover.
So at that time, Joe, when you were exploring the Troubles, exploring sectarianism, as almost as an external observer, there was a lot of censorship. There was embarrassment and censorship. You were lifting the lid, and that was creating a lot of discomfort.
Oh, yeah.
Were you sometimes accused of writing propaganda?
No, but I did a broadcast. Heaney was in Dublin, and Longley was on one side of me, and Carson was on the other side.
Kieran Carson.
Kieran Carson. And we had to rehearse what we were going to say before we went on live. We were all careful, and there was a big poster of mine, More Terrors, and I thought since they had that, they were going to let me get by easily. But toward the end, the man who was interviewing us said, Mr. Fiacc, don't you agree that your poems could be used by the paramilitary as propaganda? And I said, yes, but they would have to be intelligent. I was thinking of John Hewitt saying that you have to be intelligent to read my stuff because I'm difficult. And the IRA nearly killed me.
You didn't make any friends in paramilitary places.
Right.
But you were a maverick, Joe. You adopted a maverick position, and this book, The Wearing of the Black, was
The beginning.
it symbolized you
Yeah.
as a maverick, which meant that, is it fair to say that you were out in the cold for a little while?
Right.
No? And you obviously suffered close personal loss in the Troubles as well. You had a close friend who was a young poet in Glengormley,
Yeah.
Jared McLaughlin.
Yeah. When he was a boy, I met his mother in some shop, and the mother said to me, Jared writes poems. And I said to her, well, tell him to bring some of his poems up to the house and I'll read them. And they were just schoolboy poems. And I cheered them up and said, and Nancy said, you have that kid thinking he's Shakespeare. And when Nancy left me, he started to come to the house. And he used to come to the house every weekend. And then he told me he was being followed. You see them in the car and they're fingering you. They're telling you they're going to kill you. And I couldn't believe that anybody would want to shoot Jerry. That gave me a real breakdown. And, I made him write down the names of the people who were in the car. And he wrote down the license of the car, a description of the people in it. And I was horrified. And Jim Gracie, the head of my publisher, Blackstone, said, bring that evidence to his father. And I did, but his father wouldn't take it. Because he had a big family. He didn't want them to become...
So that event, it obviously had a strong impact on you.
Yeah.
But
It
you also
triggered something.
But you also wrote one or two poems about that particular event, about a young poet that you had a lot of time
You
for.
see, the people that were coming to my house, they all knew him. And as Jerry Shaw said, it broke something.
It changed the atmosphere.
It changed the atmosphere.
Okay, you explored the Troubles. You had explored a lot of other subjects. You had explored mythology when you were starting to write when you were in America.
Yeah.
You explored the American Indian tradition. But the Troubles, for good or ill, was the subject that you have probably become known for. Because you wrote honestly about the Troubles, Joe, it caused you to be not so popular for a period, but in recent times your popularity has increased once again.
Yeah, because terrorism is increasing.
Mm-hmm.
It's about terrorism.
Mm-hmm. So you've reflected on a society that we have here which had problems. You were able to see
And
them.
then you see, I hate war, I'm up against war.
But you confronted, in your poetry, you confronted the ugliness of
Yeah.
our situation. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, it pleases me now that I'm old that I've done something.
That you had the bravery to be a voice in the crowd.
That's right.
Okay, so you're getting a little bit of recognition now. You've been featured in Radio 4. There have been 2 or 3 books published relating to your work. How does that make you feel now? You know, you've at the end of you've had a long career in poetry. What's your feelings at this stage? Are you?
Well, no, I'm happy now because I'm at the end of the road.
Well, you know that your message has got out.
That pleases me,
Yeah.
that I've done something. Because when you get old, people write wee paragraphs about you, and you see your whole life in a wee paragraph. And I'm getting better than that. Right up.
And books and radio broadcasts. And
Yeah.
so you're getting.
And I'll be on TV one day.
You're going to be a hotshot, as you would say in New York. We're coming close to the end. So who would you describe as people that have been influential in your writing, other writers or other people that have influenced your writing?
My mother used to read Yeats to me because she never really lost her love for Ireland and Joyce. And one writer wrote his thesis on me, and he got an MA, is it? Yeah. And he went off to Beirut.
That's right. Brian Keenan?
Brian Keenan.
I see. So just in conclusion, Joe, you've seen a lot of changes in this community and this society. Do you have a vision for the future? Do you have a sense of the future?
It's too small an incident, just as the war that the Orange had celebrated. It's too small. And Europe will take over. I said, but I don't know what way the world is going because I study scientific things, and especially on TV, where I see they've discovered another sun twice as big as ours. And you see, and Jupiter is next door to us, and even if a stone was thrown from Jupiter, we could break this planet in pieces.
You remain philosophical about the future.
In the seminary, when I was leaving it, this priest, he was from Texas, and he criticized me severely, but he asked me one day to paint a mural. I used to paint, and I painted a mural from the culture of Europe, all Egypt, Greece, you know, all that. And I had a beautiful picture of Nefertiti, the Pharaoh's daughter. But when I came to the end of the mural, I had this big wall, all brown. And the priest said to me, he said, what's that brown? He said, and I said, I'll give you 3 guesses. I said, it's what the blacks call sheet.
Joe, just in terms of our own local place here, do you sense any real sense of community in Belfast these days? We're talking about 2010. I know you probably don't walk the streets anymore, but do you have any sense that we have community?
Yeah, I think Belfast should, instead of Derry, I think Belfast should have been given a cultural salute.
You think so?
Because of all the young poets
Mm-hmm.
and painters. There's a whole lot of young people doing creative work, and I think that's a good sign.
Joe, are you a Belfast man or a New Yorker?
Both. That's where the schizophrenia comes. Everything's both.
And the last thing I'm going to ask you, and it's a tongue-in-cheek question, Joe. Does poetry have any purpose?
But that's why it has purpose, because it has no purpose. People aren't living and dying because of a poem.
So on that note, Joe, I'm going to say thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you. I've really enjoyed this very, very much indeed.